not trade, it's globalization. And globalization is, trade is only a piece of globalization. Uh, Financial flows today far, far outweigh trade flows. Technology flows are extremely important today. Um, you have to look at the whole picture. So, I mean, let me go back to Japan for an example. In the 1980s, Japan had very low tariffs, lower than US tariffs. And yet, outside countries somehow just couldn't sell in Japan. And why was that? Well, it was partly because the distribution systems in Japan were controlled by these keiretsu, these monopoly industrial groups. It was because in order to sell someplace, you have to have distributors. Well, if the distributors are all locked up, it's hard to sell. Look at automobiles. Korea sells no cars in Japan today. There's no tariff on cars in Japan. US sells very few cars in Japan. There's no tariffs. Why can't they sell cars? Because they can't get dealers. And to sell cars, you got to have dealers. Now, in Japan, the dealer is not independent. So a Toyota dealer sells only Toyotas. Nissan dealer sells only Nissans. In the US, I go down into town here and I got, Bob Char's Buick, Bob Char's Honda, Bob Char's Hyundai. A dealer can sell to anybody's cars. That's a huge difference in market access. Let's look at China. China is doing all these trade deals, but honestly, these deals are not really very important. Tariffs today are not really a big issue, except in very limited circumstances. But let's talk about China has identified these made in China 2025 industries. Do you think that, let's take semiconductors, which China is desperately trying to catch up. A foreign semiconductor company is not going to be subsidized in China the way a Chinese semiconductor company is going to be subsidized. It's not going to have the same licensing ability to get licenses and so forth. If, let's take aviation, China wants to build a commercial aircraft. Interestingly, Honeywell some time ago, not Honeywell, General Electric moved its avionics division to Shanghai. Why did they do that? I mean, GE's avionics is far, far, far advanced over China's. Why don't the Chinese buy the avionics? Because China said, hey, GE, you want to sell avionics here? You got to make them here. Now, no tariffs, ostensibly free trade, but it's not free trade. So you have to look at the whole structural context to determine whether this is really an open market or the barriers are something other than tariffs.
Okay, let me in again for a moment. We are now at the half-hour mark, and we have a couple of interesting questions by viewers. I'll turn it back over to you, but I'll read off a couple of these questions for Mr. Prestowitz. The first one says, are the major Western democracy investing sufficiently strategic technology, R&D, resources, especially education, STEM, is essential if there's going to be a counter to Chinese power?
If I understood the question correctly, you're saying that to counter China, the West or the US needs to have a much more robust technological development capacity.
And right? Education. And education.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Absolutely. Yeah. In fact, in my book, I call for a doubling of U.S. spending on research and development. And I have a very extensive recommendation on changing our educational system and taking advantage of better advantage of the educational ability that we do have. Yeah, absolutely.
And the second question that is in the same vein and the follow-up saying, many would hold that the US has huge latent technological capacity. Why is it not mobilizing it sufficiently?
Yeah.
Would that not take a little bit out of the edge out of this confrontation?
Well, that is a really good and well-informed question. Whoever asked that question, I want to give them a blue medal. So it's correct. The US has this huge latent capacity, but we're not using it. Let me explain something that is not well understood typically. In the United States, major corporations are defined legally as persons with all the rights of a person, which means that corporations can make large political donations to political candidates. They, of course, are able to go to court if a corporation thinks that it's being wronged in some way. It can go to legal resources and try to get a ruling by a court. A U.S. corporation can sue in court the U.S. government and often win against the U.S. government. In Washington, a CEO, let's say Tim Cook, like of Apple, or Fred Smith of FedEx, or any major CEO in Washington, that person is powerful. That person has instant entree to the White House, to the Secretary of State, to Congress. That person makes political donations. That person is powerful. In Beijing, that person is on his knees. That person has no political influence. And that person is not going to take the Chinese government to court because he knows that he's not going to win in court in China against the Chinese government. Moreover, that person knows that in China, there's such a thing as the death of 1,000 cuts. And so, if you're acting in a way that Beijing doesn't like, so many things can happen. The electricity goes out. There was a faulty switch somewhere. The electricity went out. Inspection for medical inspection. I mean, all kinds of things can happen that slow you down and disadvantage you, and they're informal. They just kind of happen. So in effect, we talk about Apple as an American company. It's not. It's a Chinese company. All of these companies that are big in China, the CEOs are hostage. They testify. When they testify before the U.S. Congress, they always claim that they represent American business. No. They represent Beijing. We have a U.S.-China Council here in Washington. It's businessmen from U.S. companies who do business in China. The Business Council, it publishes studies and papers, it testifies before Congress. But that group is really strongly beholden to Beijing. So in a way, the U.S. corporate world is more committed to pursuing China's 5-year plans than it is to pursuing any U.S. 5-year plan. The second problem is that our economists for the last 50 years, Western economists, particularly Anglo economists, have opposed industrial policy. They have argued that industrial policy is just subsidization of corporations, and it's government picking winners and losers. And everybody knows that government can't pick winners and losers, and it's just wasted money. And so the combination of the economics community being against industrial policy and the corporations being captured by China makes it very difficult to actually get a coordinated U.S. free world response.
Now, one final question in that regard. One viewer asked very pointedly, and I guess asked your opinion in particular, having served 4 presidents, what are the signals you see coming out of the Biden administration? Are they going to try to do a reset in terms of American rejuvenation, or is it going to be all the same?
Well, I think it's not going to be, I think the Biden administration is not going to return to the policies of the Obama administration. I think there has been, we've crossed a big channel in that people recognize finally that China is not going to become like us. It's not going to become a responsible stakeholder in the Western system. So I think that's recognized. I think that Biden will be more diplomatic than Trump. The Biden team will speak less in a more coordinated fashion and will be less abrupt and less rough with allies. Biden has emphasized that he wants to talk to U.S. allies. And so I think there will be an attempt to coordinate with allies. But I think that the Biden team will essentially continue, perhaps in a smoother, more coordinated way, many of the policies of the Trump administration. I think that it will try to bring the EU and Japan and Australia and India into closer cooperation and coordination with the US. The one thing I fear is that there will continue to be this lingering element of trying to convince China to be like us. You have to keep in mind that virtually all any American leader who's studied at an elite university in the US, if you look at Biden's people, they're all from elite universities. They've all been inculcated with this Anglo laissez-faire free trade doctrine. And on top of that, I should have mentioned Wall Street. I mentioned how CEOs are captive by China. Well, Wall Street is even more captive by China. And Wall Street is important politically in the United States. So I have a fear that there will be a tendency to satisfice and to try to sail between Charybdis and Charybdis, but I'm hoping that there will be a recognition, a deep recognition, that this is not only for the U.S., not only a question of how to deal with China, but I think it's also a question of how to deal with our own internal problems. If you look at the political division in the U.S., a lot of this unrest that we're seeing, in my view, can be traced to displacement. It can be traced to middle class and workers who have, because of globalization, have been displaced. Former auto workers whose jobs went to Mexico or went to Korea. Former Silicon Valley workers whose jobs went to Taiwan or Korea or Japan. And by dint of trying to reshore U.S. production, by dint of reestablishing a technological industrial base, I think that also would revitalize the U.S. economy and bring a greater peace to U.S. politics.
Scott, you want to go?
Yeah, I guess 2 or 3 questions have come out of that. To start with the financial system, Wall Street, of course, likes to do big underwritings for Chinese companies, but also for decades now, Wall Street has been pushing outsourcing, downgrading manufacturing, providing incentives to outsource manufacturing to other countries, not just from company to company. Right. And on top of that, you'll see a great deal of interest in social media, software, flying taxis, whatever, and very little interest in manufacturing.
Right.
So we have not only the interests of Wall Street, which are very clear, but also a bias against manufacturing in the venture capital community, with Elon Musk being the major exception that proves the rule. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, no, it's good, very good question. So I think that what the two things have economic policies over the past half century. One of them is that when, excuse me, so Wall Street has a quarterly focus, quarterly earnings, short-term focus comes out of Wall Street. And corporations have begun, reward their executives with stock options, and stock options vest in a period of time, typically pretty short term. So the Wall Street emphasis is on short-term performance. If you're in a capital-intensive industry, it's hard to get high returns in the short term. And hence this great temptation to put the capital stuff someplace else. We'll just do the fancy high tech and the design, let those guys do the grunt work, and we'll make quick, high profits. Apple has done that. Most of the semiconductor companies have done that. And it's the natural result of the Wall Street short-term quarterly earnings interest. But it's also a result of something else, which is that our economists, when they calculate the benefits of free trade and globalization, they tend to assume that we will have full employment. The models are typically based on an assumption of full employment. And if they're not, they typically try to adjust for unemployment. But they adjust in terms of thinking, okay, there will be some unemployment, but it'll be temporary. So yeah, maybe an auto worker loses his job, but in a couple of years he'll be back. And so the loss is only that 2-year period when the auto worker is making nothing or making much less than he made before. And then the other thing that's not counted at all is the cost of the loss of skills. So, when you close, let's say, a machine tool factory, making machine tools requires a lot of different skills, not necessarily university degrees, but skills. You close a factory, not only do you lose the production, but you lose the skills. And the skills are not easily regenerated. And so, because we haven't counted those losses in our models, in my view, we haven't accurately calculated the benefits and the pros and cons of globalization. Let's just look at another thing that's very simple but amazing. Globalization requires supply chains, and supply chains depend on ships and airplanes. Ships and airplanes are huge contributors to greenhouse gases. We don't count the cost of those greenhouse gases when we do the free change globalization calculations. Well, we should. Will it be fair and honest to ourselves? We want to reduce greenhouse gases. They're costly. We shouldn't be flying around. We shouldn't be shipping around. We ought to be producing more locally, but we don't include those costs. So what I would say is, look, if we really do honest cost accounting, we look at the cost of lost skills, the cost of displacement, the cost of another element of this is that let's say all of our shirts are probably made in Bangladesh. So you and I are paying I don't know, maybe $10 or $15 less for a shirt than we would if the shirt was made domestically. So yeah, it's nice. I like to put $15 in my pocket, but that's the pleasure I get from that $15 is qualitatively far less than the pain of the seamstress who lost her job. When the U.S. auto industry takes a big hit, a city like Detroit goes from being a wonderful world-class city to being a slum. And the cost of that slum is not temporary. The cost of that slum is long running. And it's not counted when the economists do their calculation of benefit and loss. Those costs should be counted. And when you count those costs, my calculation says we're much better off doing much more production domestically and taking the longer term look. I would recommend that instead of even doing our accounting on a quarterly basis, we do it on an annual basis, get rid of the quarterly report for Wall Street, and begin thinking like the Germans and like the Japanese and like the Chinese.
Well, it would certainly make my job more interesting, being a stock analyst.
I want to make your job interesting.
Yeah, much more interesting. Seriously, to do real forecasting and real analysis instead of second guessing the traders, right? Yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned be more like Germany, be more like Japan, because if we look at the economic relationship between those countries and China, we see it's much more balanced than the relationship between America and China.
Absolutely.
And also larger. So Japan does something like 40% more trade with China than it does with the United States.
Right.
So the United States going out and telling the Japanese, don't sell to China, cut your supply chains, that's like, please commit harakiri for us. It doesn't make any sense. It seems to me the problem is in America.
Remember that the Japanese, excuse me, about a year ago did in fact implement a new program in which they subsidized companies to bring their production back to Japan. In fact, that's something I think we ought to copy the Japanese on. And when we say that Japan has more trade with China than with us, these flows get to be tricky. Japan is sending parts to China to come here. So they're counted when they go to China, they're counted as a Japanese export to China. When they come here, they're not counted as a Japanese export to the US, but it's kind of circular. But I think that the larger point is, for me at least, is this. When I go to meetings of American economists, typically they don't want to talk about manufacturing. And they're saying manufacturing is the past, and the future is high tech. It's Google and Facebook, et cetera. And then I look at Germany and I say, okay, in the U.S., manufacturing is about 9 or 10% of GDP. Germany is a high wage country. Manufacturing is 18% of GDP, twice as much as in the U.S. Japan's a high wage country, manufacturing 20% of GDP. I think it's realistic for us to be aiming for manufacturing to be 16, 17% of GDP.
Okay. Uwe, do you have other questions from listeners?
I just, maybe stepping back a little bit from the details of what goes on in a given country at this moment. If we look at the try to be forecasters at the moment, and you've been a forecaster, right? And so where is this going? I mean, what if we want a win-win rather than some kind of horrendous outcome of constant and building frictions, which might even lead to military confrontation. Where, on the positive side, where can we go? So the U.S. has to rebuild. What else has to happen? I mean, what are, in your view?
It's very, very important for other major free world countries, Germany, Japan, India. It's very important for those countries to come along with us, or I mean, they have lessons that they could teach us. But my point is, I do believe it's important that we have a coherent free world bloc that can respond to China. I mentioned 5G, and you made the point that the US has been trying to weaken Huawei, and that's true. But what we haven't done is to strengthen a Western 5G capacity. And here's Nokia and here's Ericsson, and they have the technology. So I think that we should be working with them to support and make them the world leader rather than Huawei. But I also think that we need to have a different kind of conversation with China. And I think that we need to be able to, on the one hand, we ought, in my view, we ought to stop trying to tell the Chinese to be like us. They're not going to be like us. And China is aiming to be a major world country, and it has its own idea of what the global structure should look like and how it should operate. It's very different from ours. I think we ought to make it clear to the Chinese that we are not going to try to impose anything on them, but we also are not going to accept anything being imposed upon us. And I think that there are things that we could do. Back in the Cold War with the Soviet Union, we had a lot of arrangements with the Soviets to be sure that we didn't accidentally get into trouble. So we had rules about how our ships maneuvered around each other. And we had rules about communication. I think attempting to establish with the Chinese some of the protocols that we had with the Soviets would not be a bad idea. In the South China Sea, the potential for some kind of an accident is high. And it would be good to try to reduce that kind of potential. But I think mainly it's a matter of us getting our own country properly oriented. I don't think that we should. This point I made earlier about U.S. so-called U.S. companies essentially being hostage to China, that needs to be changed. A year or so ago, when the kids in Hong Kong were demonstrating for freedom, and they were using an app from the Apple App Store to track where the Hong Kong police were, so that they could go and demonstrate someplace where the police weren't. And Beijing leaned on Tim Cook and Apple to take that app out of the App Store, and Apple did. Then in another instance, University of California, San Diego invited the Dalai Lama to come speak at the university. And the Chinese Students and Scholars Association at the university went into a big uproar to stop the Dalai Lama from coming to San Diego, University of California, San Diego. Well, we need to stop that kind of stuff. Think about the manager of the Houston Royals basketball team, and he tweeted in favor of the demonstrators in Hong Kong. And suddenly the NBA is wiped out of broadcasting its games in China. Um, well, my view is we need to make it clear that we can't be pushed around, and that our companies and our individuals aren't going to be subjected to that kind of censorship.
Scott, any?
Yes, yes. One of the more interesting proposals in your book is an allied infrastructure investment program for the Philippines, which of course would be a very wise strategic move in the South China Sea. Do you think American politicians would support that?
I hope they would. It's interesting you asked that question. I just had this morning, I had a question from a friend of mine in the Philippines. The Philippines is suffering badly from COVID right now. And they're trying to get a vaccine, and it looks like they're going to get the Chinese vaccine. And my friend sent me an email asking if the Chinese vaccine was safe. And I thought, this is such a huge missed opportunity. We should be dumping vaccine in the Philippines. Philippines wants American vaccine. They don't trust the Chinese vaccine. But whether the American body politic will see that, I just can't say. I have friends in the incoming administration. I think some of them would be amenable to that kind of thing. We do have, Trump did establish as part of the, we have a small kind of infrastructure bank that is becoming more active. So I have some hope. Put it there, I have some hope.
Okay, and what about Taiwan? If China takes Taiwan, it will control the production of most American semiconductors. And furthermore, if they put their Communist Party representatives into the offices of the Taiwanese semiconductor companies, they'll have access to our semiconductor designs. So Taiwan is extremely important. The technology angle of the importance of Taiwan doesn't get enough attention.
It's never, yeah, you're absolutely right. It's never mentioned, and it's absolutely critical. On the one hand, if Xi would love to bring Taiwan into the fold as he's bringing Hong Kong into the fold, it would certainly raise him to the level, perhaps even above the level of Mao Zedong in the Chinese pantheon. But on top of that, if he was able to bring Taiwan into the fold, he would have the world's leading semiconductor company, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corp, TSMC. He would have it. And he would have the designs of all of the major US companies like Qualcomm and NVIDIA and so forth. And at the same time, the relative power of the US in the South China Sea is diminishing. And so I think it's a very dangerous situation. What scares me is I think that the vast bulk of the American press and of the American government just don't understand. In fact, last week there was an article in the Wall Street Journal written by a journal reporter who covers the semiconductor industry. And he was talking about how Apple and Amazon are no longer going to buy their semiconductors from Intel, but they're going to make them themselves. That's not right. Apple and Amazon are not going to make their own chips. They're going to design their chips, and they're going to send them to TSMC to be made.
Yes.
Very few people understand that. And I have heard, high-level people in the U.S. government make the comment that if it looked like China was going to take over Taiwan, that the US ought to bomb TSMC to prevent it from falling into the hands of the Chinese.
Yeah.
So that's how significant TSMC is. Yeah.
Yeah, and then there's no American semiconductor industry either. That's brilliant.
So, I mean, now the good news is TSMC is building a fab in Arizona. And hopefully within a year or so, TSMC will be in the US. But right now, yeah, it's people think that the US semiconductor industry is king of the world, and it's not.
Okay. Uwe, how are we doing for time and questions? I don't want to deprive other people of their questions.
We are through the hour right now, and I think we've covered an enormous amount of ground. What emerges, and I do not want to try and summarize, but what emerges to me as a clear view is that. All right, first premise to fundamentally try and change China is not a good premise for policy. The need for the United States to rejuvenate technologically in every respect is a necessary element of policy. And in between, we have to try to presumably, actually make things work without getting into a major confrontation. Does that sort of seem right to you as a summary, Clyde?
Sounds good to me.
Okay. All right. Well, we thank you both, Clyde Prestowitz, a senior American statesman, and for many, many decades, since the early days of the Reagan administration, and Scott Foster, an observer of the technology scene from a time when perhaps not Japan, but certainly Korea or Taiwan and so on were not really players to a point where they've become major players, not only actually reaching the levels of Japan, but perhaps going beyond. We also, of course, have Scott to thank for many articles for Asia Times, and in addition to thanking everybody for attending, I'd like to urge you, since we also need to make money, to buy subscriptions to Asia Times, where you will find many, many articles, including today a very detailed description of the status of the Chinese semiconductor industry by none other than our Scott Foster. Thank you very much, everybody, and I hereby conclude this very, very interesting.
Thanks, Clyde.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.